Hello everyone, my name is Abby and I'm the Young Adult Assistant at the Twin Lakes Library System and I use she, her pronouns. So today for Slice of Life, I'm going to be talking to you about why I think you should consider using audiobooks if you do not already use audiobooks. So every time I do one of the must-read Mondays or when Dabney does their must-read Mondays, we will typically mention if it's available on our audiobook ebook service called Hoopla. And if you've never been on there before, this is kind of what it looks like. It's just an app, you just put in your library card. Or our other audiobook service / ebook service, Libby, which this is what this also looks like. So I am just going to get right into it, why I think you should consider it. I myself am not the biggest audiobook person, but I do listen to audiobooks for the reasons that I'm going to list to you in a little bit, but I think that they are a great resource. It's kind of incredible that someone came up with a whole different way to consume books that involves listening. It's really, it's great that it's available because there are some people who, are visually impaired and cannot really read books in a traditional sense or can't lift books for whatever reason, and so audiobooks are a great available option for them. But here are all the reasons why I think you should consider audiobooks. So if you are a busy person, so if you have to drive a lot for work, or you have school and you don't really have time to just sit down and read a book, audiobooks are great to have as a resource for you to use when you're doing other things. So if you're doing laundry, that's typically when I listen to audiobooks, when I'm like doing housework. I'll listen to an audiobook while I'm washing the dishes or doing laundry or sweeping the floor, a bunch of different house things. So those are all good options. If you are out going for a walk, you can listen to an audiobook, so you're exercising, but you're also listening to a book and reading. If you're driving in a car with your family, you can listen to audiobooks together, and it can be kind of like a family group activity. Me and my mom, when we're together, if we're not listening to podcasts or music, we're listening to an audiobook. Like Truly Devious was an audiobook that me and my mom listened to together. We were driving somewhere that took a long period of time, and it was really fun to just interact. And she doesn't really read at the same level that I do, but if she's in the car and she's not doing anything besides driving, why not listen to an audiobook? So it's a great activity to do when you're busy, and it also helps you read even though you can't really just sit down and physically read a book. Like for me, when I was a student, I recently just graduated, but when I was a college student, sometimes when I was walking to campus or walking to work, I would be listening to an audiobook because I couldn't just sit down and read read a book while I was doing all of my reading for school. So I think that's really it's a great resource to have. I think it's an approachable start to reading more. So like I said, my mom's not the biggest reader, and neither are a lot of people in my family. My sister is a great example of this, where she's not really a big reader, but she has to drive a lot. And so she uses this service, Hoopla, and she uses a different audiobook service because I kept telling her, you really want to read more, but you aren't. If you aren't having time to just sit down, or like you don't feel like you have the energy to do it when you get back from work, you should really try audiobooks. And she did, and it definitely boosted the amount of, books she was consuming monthly, and it was really interesting to see. I would recommend books, and she'd find the audiobook version, and she would listen, and she'd get the same story that I was getting sitting there physically reading it. So that was really cool, and it was really cool to see her get more into reading, and she's read a lot of books that are like my favorite books that she also now really loves, and some other books. I think one particularly that stands out that I'm pretty sure Dabney has mentioned before is I Wish You All the Best, which is about a non-binary character named Ben, I believe. And she listened to that on audiobook after I told her how much Dabney really liked it, and she loved it, and she was like talking to me about the characters, and she hasn't read for like the longest time. Like it's been since probably middle school or early high school that she's really read for fun. So, it was a great way for her to start reading more and approaching reading more. Yeah, so then another thing is you can actually increase your speed when listening to audiobooks. So you can consume books really fast if you would like. So me personally, so right now I'm listening slash reading the physical copy, the Hazelwood. I'll show you my hoopla. So I'm a little farther because I've been physically reading it as well. But when I listen to this, I'm listening to it at a faster speed than it normally would go on. So I'm gonna hope the volume pause this. You can have a current playback speed on your audiobooks, and so mine is 1.5, but you can do, up to 3 times faster on Hoopla. There you go. That's what it looks like. So you can consume a book that's supposed to take you 12 hours to listen to, like a Hazelwood, and listen to it in like 4 hours. So you can consume it only if you think you're actually getting something out of the story, of course, when you're reading it that way. But it is nice that you can consume content that efficiently, and if you get something out of it and that works for you, you can read so many books. And when you initially weren't reading any books, that's a big change, which is great. I know that a booktuber I watch, she listens to audiobooks when she works because her job allows her to do that. And she listens to books at 3 times speed, which I don't know how she does it, but she does. And she reads a crazy ton of books every year because she's listening to audiobooks when she's just doing things that she wouldn't be able to sit down and read doing. So I think that's really cool. And it's also less daunting because I think sometimes when you see how long audiobooks are, like the Hazelwood is 12 hours long, that could be daunting for someone. But if you are like, well, I read this at 2 times speed, then it's only a 6-hour long period. And, with a couple tasks of chores and driving, you could probably finish that book in the week. So I think that's really cool. Some audiobooks feel like they're movies. So if you're a big movie person and you're not a big reader, but you like storytelling, I think that audiobooks are really great as a thing for you to utilize. There's some audiobooks that I'm going to talk about a little bit later because I wanted to talk about a couple of my favorite audiobooks that are just they have different voice actors and they have different special effects going on, and it just really works. And some authors, I think, do a really good job at making their stories really work as an audiobook. There's some books that I don't think you should read. You should read in audiobook format. I think they're better to read physically, but there are some books that they put in so much production into it that they make sure that audiobooks are going to be a really immersive experience. So I think that's really enjoyable, and I like that. And then the last thing, sort of why I think you should consider audiobooks, is they really help you with topics that you would struggle with reading just a book. Dabney and I were actually talking about this yesterday. I was reading a book and I was talking to them about it, and they were saying it was something that they didn't really think that they would sit down and read, but listening to it on audio made it something that they could consume, which I think really speaks to audiobooks. I know a lot of fellow English majors, we have to do a lot of reading, and some books are not the most interesting, and that's, it happens every once in a while, but audiobooks make it easier for us to consume that much content that we're getting in. It's not something, so for myself, I'm not a big Shakespeare fan, which is a crime to say as an English major, but I'm not a big Shakespeare fan, and I had to take a whole class that was just about Shakespeare, and it wasn't the most fun, and I had to read all of his plays, but I don't really like reading plays because, I think they're better when you see them, not when you're reading them. So I would find audiobook versions of the plays and I would listen to them. And so I was still getting the same experience of reading it physically, but it was just in a way that I could consume the content and wouldn't be bored. And I actually think I ended up understanding them a little bit better when I heard them read to me rather than me just sitting there trying to read it. So I think nonfiction is a great genre to pursue when listening to audiobooks. I don't really love just sitting down and reading nonfiction. I find it kind of boring sometimes. But when I listen to it in audiobook format, it's kind of like I'm listening to a documentary, if that makes sense. And I love documentaries, which is very strange why I wouldn't like nonfiction. But it just works for me. And so if there are certain genres that you think that you wouldn't enjoy just physically reading, but you are sort of interested in, I think getting an audiobook version of that works perfectly with that. So I have a ton of nonfiction books saved on my Hoopla that I would love to listen to. I don't know if I would ever physically pick them up to read, but I would love to listen to them. So I think they're great for that. And just like a little sidebar note about our audiobook services. What's great too is Hoopla specifically, I think, is excellent. You can check out 10 books a month on Hoopla, and if it's a book, let me think, for instance. So, for instance, when the Michelle Obama autobiography first came out, it was on hold for, I think, 6 months. Like, there were that many people who wanted it. And so if you want to read that book, but you're like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to want to read this in 6 months, well, Hoopla could have it available for you in audiobook format, or ebook, because it does also have ebook. You could check it out and you could read it right then and there. Hoopla is really great. You don't have to wait for, if the book is there, you don't have to wait. Like, somebody else could be listening to it, but you don't have to wait any sort of time. Libby's different, where you do have to actually wait. But I think Hoopla is a really great little app to help you with e-reading and audiobook listening, because you don't have to wait for anything if the book is there. And I would say we have a fairly large collection of books on Hoopla, which is nice. But yeah, if you don't have to wait for anything. So it's really nice if you want something and it's on Hoopla and it's backed up. Definitely try Hoopla. But anyways, so I just want to go through some of my favorite audiobooks with you. Just so you have some starting points. You like books that I like. So the first thing is literally anything Elizabeth Acevedo narrates. So if you've watched any of my videos, you probably are aware that I'm a big Elizabeth Acevedo fan. I think she's incredible. And she narrates actually all of her own books that she has released to date. So that's The Poet X, Clap When You Land, and With the Fire on High. I listened to With the Fire on High and The Poet X on audio. I physically read Clap When You Land, and I still love Clap When You Land. I thought it was incredible. But Elizabeth Acevedo, at least for The Poet X and Clap When You Land, she writes them in verse, so in like poetry form. And I just think it's such the experience of listening to her read it to you is much different than just sitting and reading. And, you know, she loves that story. You can tell she loves all of her books. So she's very passionate when she's narrating them. And you really get a feel for the emotional depth of the characters when she narrates things. So I really think if you're going to read Elizabeth Acevedo, you really should listen to her audiobooks, because they are incredible. And then she also has narrated Pride, which I think I've talked about before. Yeah, I have, in my retelling one. That is a book by E.B. Savoy, and it's a modern retelling of Pride and Prejudice with two black teens in this very, historic neighborhood. Anyways, we're not talking about that, but Elizabeth Acevedo narrates that, and I think she does a really good job embodying the characters, so that was really cool. The next book is Sadie by Courtney Summers. I don't know if I've talked about this one, but this is like one of my favorite books ever. It's very dark, so know that going in if this at all intrigues you. But what's really cool about this book is it's told in sort of two narration styles, and one of the narration styles is you're following a podcast host, and that's how you would physically read it. But when you listen to it, it's like, because there are different voice actors for every part in the book. Anyone who speaks has their own voice actor, which is amazing. It was so cool. It was like listening to a movie, as I said. So I really liked that. And I feel like if I read it physically, I wouldn't have gotten the same experience with the podcast part of the book that I did when I was listening to it on audio. So it was really immersive. I felt like I was actually listening to a podcast while also listening to what Sadie was doing in her part of the narration. And it's like a murder mystery thriller book, so it was really fascinating. If you like true crime podcasts, you would love the book Sadie, and you would love it in audio form. I know for a fact that Hoopla has that, so you should check it out. The next book series, and I've talked about this pretty recently, is the Illuminae Files, and I'm pretty sure I mentioned this in my video, but this one felt like I was listening/watching a sci-fi movie. There were special effects in the background. There were different voice actors for everything. Just the style it's done is really cool. And when you read it physically, it is told in a multimedia sort of format, but it's not, I just don't think it's the same as listening to it on audio. So I really recommend listening to those books on audio. I think it's a great experience. And sci-fi is a genre that I don't particularly reach for. I don't love it. I think it goes over my head a lot. So, you know, that's a subject that I'm not normally interested in, but I love that series because I listen to it on audiobook. Those are on Libby. That is, and I think they also have them in e-form, so, but they're not on Hoopla, but they are on Libby. And then the last series is one that I finished in 2020. It is The Raven Boys. So in full transparency, I actually didn't love the first time I listened to the audiobook, but as I started listening to them more, I really got into the narration style. I think the narrator, Will Patton, does a really good job. I think his name is Will Patton. I hope I didn't get that wrong. Let me double check that really fast. I like to make sure I'm giving you correct information. I have my phone right now so I can look it up. Maybe it's Jim Patton. No, it's Will Patton. I'm right. I'm not crazy. But that is like a magical realism story, and it's very immersive, and I really just liked how he told the story. And he's the only narrator. There's no other voice actors, but I think he does a really good job sort of embodying the characteristics of all the different characters in the book, because it is a very character-driven book series, so it was really cool to see. So yeah, so those are the reasons that I think you should consider looking into audiobooks / audiobooks I would recommend. And yeah, so I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.